Someone let the maid into the wrong room. The voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a blade. The grand hall of Harrington Manor, the venue for the will reading, fell into a suffocating hush. Light from the crystal chandelier spilled across the marble floor, reflecting off powdered faces and rehearsed smiles. Among the polished crowd, Emma Clark stood still, looking heartbreakingly out of place. She wore a simple gray linen dress and an old pale blue cardigan with frayed shoulders. Her flat shoes were as quiet as she was. Her hair was tied low, a few strands slipping loose and swaying gently in the draft that crept through the tall windows. An ordinary woman, painfully ordinary, but it was that very simplicity that made her the target of disdain. Preston Hale, the man with the gleaming gold tie and venomous smile, was the first to speak. "How surprising," he drawled. "I didn't know the Harringtons had started inviting the help to their will readings." Laughter broke out among those nearby. Beside him, his sister Madison Hale, draped in a blazing red dress, added acidly, "Maybe she's here to dust off the will table." A wave of laughter rippled through the room. The men adjusted their ties. The women lifted their champagne glasses, pretending to be discreet, while their eyes stayed locked on Emma, the intruder who dared step into their world. Emma said nothing. She only tightened her grip on the fabric strap of her small, worn cloth bag, hand-embroidered, unbranded, unremarkable. It had been with her for years, and now it served as another reason for them to mock her. In the corner, Chloe Brooks, the 24-year-old niece who owned a startup and flaunted her life online, leaned toward her friend Elise Grant, a former assistant at Harrington Enterprises. "She must be one of Uncle Richard's charity cases," Chloe whispered. "Look at that bag. She's probably carrying her lunch in it." Elise snickered, pulled out her phone, snapped a photo, and quickly typed a caption. "Thrift store chic crashes billionaire's will reading. Harrington will fail." The post went live. Within minutes, the notifications poured in, likes, comments, laughter. Faces around the room bent toward their screens, their smiles deepening as they read each cruel remark. "Oh my God, look at her. Guess she's hoping for pity. Brave of her to show up." Those invisible words pierced the air like needles, stabbing into the silence Emma was struggling to preserve. But she didn't react. She took a slow breath, her hazel eyes fixed ahead on the empty chair reserved for the lawyer who had yet to arrive. Her silence seemed to amuse them even more. They mistook it for weakness. None of them saw the steel beneath her calm. None knew that every sneer, every whispered insult was being captured by the ceiling cameras, every second, every frame. She had arranged it herself weeks ago. An older man, Gerald Hayes, shook his head. Richard Harrington always had a weakness for strays. This woman clearly doesn't belong here. His wife, draped in a necklace of glittering emeralds, added sharply, "Exactly." How shameful for the family. You can tell what kind of person she is just by the way she's dressed. The room buzzed again, a chorus of whispers that sliced away at the woman's dignity. Emma stood still. She didn't leave, didn't defend herself. She simply let them talk, because she knew they would soon see the truth. Outside, the London sky turned a pale shade of silver gray. A beam of light slipped through the tall windows, spilling across the marble floor and catching her face. In that light, her eyes no longer looked sad. They gleamed calm, steady, resolute, as if she were waiting for a storm she herself had summoned. No one in that room knew that the woman they mocked was Emma Clark Harrington, the lawful wife of Richard, the very man whose fortune they were about to fight over. And the will reading that day wasn't just about dividing an inheritance. It was a test, the final one she and Richard had designed together. A test that would make them all bow their heads, The laughter hadn't yet faded when another voice rang out, dry and cutting. "She's still here?" Tyler Ward, the young cousin of the Harringtons, sneered as he poured himself another drink. "Someone should show her where the kitchen is before the lawyer arrives." The crowd burst into laughter. Glasses clinked, their mockery echoing off the marble walls. The chandelier glittered above them, its light catching faces that no longer looked refined, only cruel, exposing the raw pleasure that comes with humiliation. Emma stood her ground, hands gently clasped in front of her, back straight, her expression calm to the point of defiance. That composure only infuriated them further. They couldn't stand that someone they considered beneath them wasn't pleading, wasn't breaking, wasn't even flinching. Madison Hale swirled the wine in her glass, the ruby-red reflection glinting on her lips. "I heard Richard had a few charity projects. Maybe she's one of them." How tragic, isn't it? She took a slow step toward Emma, her voice dripping with sugar while her eyes gleamed like knives. "Listen, I don't know who invited you, but you're making everyone uncomfortable. If you need money, my family has a foundation." Emma lifted her head. Just one glance was enough to make Madison stop mid-sentence. There was something in the other woman's eyes that couldn't be read, neither fear nor desperation, but a deliberate, unnerving calm. Then Emma smiled, a faint, fragile line of a smile. "Thank you for your kindness," she said softly, "but I don't need charity." Madison's mouth twitched, surprise flashing briefly before she let out a mocking laugh. "Confident, aren't we?" Behind them, Chloe Brooks had already pulled out her phone, secretly recording the exchange. She whispered to Elise, adjusting the camera angle. "This is going on my story. When the help thinks she's the heir." "It's going to blow up." Elise grinned, her excitement cruel and bright. Add a black and white filter, make it look more dramatic. They didn't know that a hidden camera in the corner of the ceiling was already recording everything, every word, every look. And in just a few hours, that footage would become the evidence that determined their fate. The grand doors opened suddenly, letting in a rush of cold air and the faint rustle of leaves outside. Heads turned, but it was only a staff member checking the table settings. When the door closed again, Tyler Ward sauntered over to Emma, his expression sly. He picked up a cocktail napkin, drew a few letters on it with a marker, and chuckled to his friends. Now this is the perfect accessory for her. He quietly attached the paper to the strap of Emma's cloth bag, just where she couldn't see it. Scrawled across it, in crude ink, were 2 words: charity case. Laughter erupted again, louder this time, without restraint. Chloe raised her phone, snapped a photo, and Elise added the caption, "Breaking news." The charity case just got her name tag, Family Drama. Their laughter filled the air, cruel and shameless. Emma didn't turn around. She only moved her hand slightly, as if sensing something, then set her bag down by her feet. For a brief moment, her eyes swept across the room, taking in every face, every twisted smile. Gerald Hayes, the older man in the pinstripe suit, leaned toward his wife and muttered, "She should be thrown out." Richard would lose his temper if he saw this. The woman beside him, her emerald necklace glinting under the light, nodded sharply. "She doesn't deserve to set foot in this house." A beam from the chandelier spilled across Emma's face. None of their words, none of their laughter could touch her. She stood motionless as marble, but deep in her gaze something was forming. A plan. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the corner of the ceiling, where a tiny red light blinked, a live signal. Someone was watching, and that someone had not yet arrived. No one realized her silence was a warning. She wasn't the intruder. She was the architect, the one who built this stage so they could expose their own cruelty. Outside, the clock in the great hall struck 5 minutes to 10. In just a few more minutes, Arthur Grayson, the family lawyer, would walk through those doors. And in just a few more minutes, the glittering world they believed was theirs would begin to crack. Emma drew a slow breath. She felt every heartbeat, steady and sure. There was no fear in her, only pity, because they were laughing inside their own tragedy and didn't even know it. 10 o'clock, sharp. The sound of the old grandfather clock echoed through the great hall, deep, resonant, and cold. As the final chime faded, the large doors swung open. Arthur Grayson entered, carrying himself with the solemn composure of a man long accustomed to standing at the crossroads of greed. He was past 60, his silver hair neatly combed, his gray suit immaculate down to every crease. In his hand was a worn black leather briefcase, heavy with secrets that no one in that room was prepared to hear. The chatter died away. The crowd straightened their posture, trying to recover their poise after the mockery that had filled the air minutes before. Only Emma remained still in her corner, one hand resting lightly on her bag strap, her eyes fixed on the empty chair opposite the grand oak table. "Good morning," Grayson began, his voice slow and deliberate. "By the wishes of the late Richard James Harrington, we are gathered today to read his final will." The atmosphere tightened. Somewhere in the room, a quiet voice murmured, "Finally, it's about time." It was Preston Hale, the man with the golden tie, lounging back in his chair with a half-mocking, half-eager smile. His eyes gleamed as if he were seated at an auction he was certain to win. Grayson set the briefcase on the table. The metallic click of the lock broke the silence as he opened it. From inside, he withdrew a thick envelope, sealed with red wax, bearing the insignia of the Harrington estate. The room held its breath. This is the final will, drafted 3 years ago and legally certified. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Gerald Hayes frowned. 3 years ago? But Richard died only 6 months back. Grayson didn't look up. "I only read what he left behind. If there's something unexpected, then that's exactly what he intended." He broke the wax seal. The soft crack sliced through the tension in the room like a blade. Grayson unfolded the document and laid it flat on the table. His voice was low and steady, every word cutting through the silence like an engraving in stone. "I, Richard James Harrington, being of sound mind, hereby declare this to be my final will and testament." All eyes were fixed on him. Preston leaned back with a smirk. "All right, let's get to the good part. Who's the heir?" Grayson read on, unfazed. "To my family, friends, and associates, I leave nothing." The room froze. A few short laughs broke out, then quickly died as he continued. "Because wealth does not define a person. It only reveals who they truly are." The air seemed to drain from the room. Madison blinked in disbelief. Chloe looked up from her phone, her face pale. Gerald shook his head, his voice tight with anger. Ridiculous. He must be joking. Grayson paused, his gaze steady on the stunned crowd, then continued. "All assets, shares, properties, and intellectual rights shall be transferred to one person only. The one who stood by me when I had nothing but my own humanity. The one who never cared for fame, money, or power. That person is my wife, Emma Clark Harrington." Not a breath moved. Then, like an explosion, the room erupted. Preston shot to his feet. "What? Richard never married anyone!" Madison's mouth fell open, her wine glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the marble floor. Chloe stood frozen, whispering, "His wife? That can't be true." Gerald slammed his palm on the table. "This is fraud!" A woman like her could never. Every eye turned to Emma. She stood motionless, silent, unflinching. Grayson calmly opened another compartment in his briefcase and withdrew a folder. This will is accompanied by supporting documents, marriage certificate, wedding photographs, handwritten letters, and verified witnesses. He placed the first photo on the table. Richard, wearing a simple suit, smiling warmly, his arm around Emma in a plain white dress. The date printed below, 7 years ago. The room exploded again. "Fake!" Preston roared. "Photoshop!" Chloe shouted. Madison's face drained of color as she hissed, "She staged all of this! She tricked us!" Emma didn't respond. She stepped forward, her gaze gentle but cold. Her voice rose, soft yet sharp as tempered steel. "No, I didn't deceive anyone. I'm only standing here to see who among you still remembers that he was a man, not just a walking bank." Silence fell heavy. In that moment, the woman they had mocked no longer looked like a maid. She was the center of the room, unshakable and commanding. Grayson gave a faint nod. "The reading isn't over," he said evenly. "And trust me, the next part is where it truly begins." "Impossible!" Preston Hale shouted, his voice trembling with panic and disbelief. "Richard Harrington never married anyone. This is her scam." The outcry spread like a flood breaking loose. Chairs scraped across the marble, glass shattered, and a storm of angry whispers filled the air. Each person clung desperately to the hope that those papers were forged, that the photograph was a clever fabrication. Because if it wasn't, they would have to face the truth that everything they had been dreaming of, the money, the shares, the prestige, had vanished with a single sentence. Grayson said nothing. He calmly opened the folder and laid each document on the table with the patience of a man long accustomed to the chaos of human greed. "This is a legally registered marriage certificate," he said, his voice low but firm. "Signed on June 16th, 7 years ago, verified by the London City Hall." A wave of silence spread through the room. He continued, "These are the 2 witnesses present that day, Sarah Ellis, a nurse, and Michael Reed, a librarian. Both have confirmed the marriage took place and was fully legal." He held up several letters, old paper, slightly yellowed, with Richard's slanted handwriting and faint ink stains along the edges. "These are letters written by Mr. Harrington to Mrs. Emma over the years. Each one has been authenticated by handwriting experts." Madison let out a bitter laugh. "Handwritten letters? You expect us to believe a few pieces of paper and some old photos? She probably paid someone to forge all of it." Chloe nodded fiercely, gripping her phone. "I'm calling my lawyer. This can't be real." But Grayson's voice remained steady, precise, unshaken. "If you still doubt, then see for yourselves." He plugged a small USB into the laptop on the oak table. A projector flickered to life, casting a white glow across faces now twisted with anger and fear. A video began to play. The footage was slightly grainy, a bit shaky, recorded outside the city hall. Richard Harrington stood there, younger, dressed in a simple suit. Beside him was Emma, wearing a pure white dress, her smile so gentle and genuine that the entire room seemed to stop breathing. The 2 exchanged rings, their hands trembling slightly as they said their vows before the witnesses. When the words, "Yes, I do," echoed, the hall fell utterly silent. Nothing was staged. Nothing was false. It was real. The frame froze on Richard, wrapping his arms around Emma, his eyes glowing in the golden afternoon light. Grayson spoke softly. "This is the day Mr. Richard Harrington chose his life partner. And that person is Mrs. Emma Clark Harrington, the woman standing here among you." No one could speak. Chloe lowered her phone, her hands shaking. Elise avoided Emma's eyes. Madison stepped back, lips pressed tight, as if every cruel word she had ever said had suddenly turned into a weight she could no longer carry. Preston broke the silence with a shout. No, no, she tricked him. She manipulated him. He pointed at Emma, his voice rising to a near scream. Richard was a genius. He would never choose someone like you. Emma lifted her head. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but every word rang clear. He didn't choose by status. He chose by heart. Her gaze swept across the room, faces flushed with shame, eyes darting away, hands gripping the edges of their chairs as if afraid to lose their standing. And you, she said, even after his death, you still see nothing but money. The words fell like ice, freezing the air around them. In the muted daylight, filtering through the windows, Emma seemed larger than herself, not the humiliated woman they once mocked, but a mirror reflecting their truth. The silence didn't last. Tyler Ward let out a dark laugh, stepping forward. Fine, you want us to believe you're Richard Harrington's wife? Then where's your husband? If he's dead, who's here to prove it? Where is he? The room fell into a tense hush. Every eye turned to Emma, waiting for her to break, to cry, to flee. But she only smiled, a calm, unsettling smile, both gentle and dangerous. You want to know? She said quietly, her voice steady and low, like a still lake before a storm. Very well, because the truth is about to walk in. Grayson froze for a moment, his eyes flicking toward her, as if he already knew what was coming. Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a small silver remote. She pressed the button. The screen behind her flickered, shifting from the old wedding footage to a live feed. A man appeared on the screen, sharp features, steady gaze, eyes bright with life. Richard Harrington, alive, and staring straight at them. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Glasses slipped from hands. Phones hit the floor. Gasps filled the room. Emma didn't turn to look at the screen. She simply spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying through every corner of the hall. Now, she said, let's see who truly belongs in this family. The sound of sharp, uneven breaths filled the room as the image on the screen came into focus. Richard Harrington, the man the world believed had died in a plane crash 6 months earlier, was sitting there, alive and real. The dim light in the room where he appeared couldn't hide the icy sharpness in his gray-blue eyes. Every line of his face was resolute, still, and as cold as a blade. The entire room fell silent. "Good morning," he said, his deep voice echoing through the speakers like a sentence being passed. "It seems you've all forgotten the most important thing I ever taught you." He paused. "Not everything that glitters is gold, and not everyone dressed simply is beneath you." The silence stretched tight like a wire. Preston Hale stumbled back, his lips trembling. "No, this is staged. It's a fake video." But as soon as he spoke, the corner of the screen displayed a live timestamp. April 15th, 10:32 a.m. The time matched perfectly with the clock on the wall. "Oh my God," Chloe whispered, her hand trembling as it covered her mouth. Madison collapsed into her chair, her shoulders shaking. Gerald Hayes stammered, "It can't be, he's alive." Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers interlaced before him. "I expected this reaction," he said, "because Emma warned me. She knows better than anyone what each of you truly is." His eyes shifted, focusing toward the distant corner of the room where Emma stood beside the oak table. She told me, "If they believe you're dead, they'll show who they really are." A faint smile crossed his lips, not a warm smile, but a weary one, the smile of a man who has seen too much of human nature. She was right. Emma stood motionless, her eyes filled with quiet light and sorrow. They had planned this together, every detail, every hidden camera, every test. Yet hearing his voice again still made her heart tremble, not from fear, but from love. Richard's tone dropped. heavy and low. I didn't fake my death to punish anyone. I did it to see the truth. I wanted to believe that among everyone who bears the Harrington name, at least a few still had integrity, respect, and a shred of humanity. But today he paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. All I see is deceit. The metallic click of Arthur Grayson closing his briefcase broke the silence. He knew his part in this had ended, because in that moment the doors at the back of the room opened. A real man stepped inside, no longer through a screen, no longer through a camera. Richard Harrington, alive, present, and towering like a storm, breaking into that grand, glittering room. His white shirt was slightly wrinkled, no tie, his leather shoes still dusted from the road. He didn't need wealth or polish to command silence. His presence alone was enough. The room froze. Preston stumbled backward, bumping into the table. Madison covered her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief. Chloe nearly fell as she stepped back in shock. Only Emma stood firm, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the entire world disappeared, leaving only the two of them. Richard walked toward her, each step echoing with the weight of judgment. When he reached her, he gently took her hand. The simple gesture radiated warmth so deep it made her close her eyes. No words were needed, because everything had already been proven. He turned to face the crowd. "She," he said, his voice ringing through the hall, "is the reason I still believe in humanity. And you," his gaze swept over them, piercing, unyielding. "You are the reason I walked away from it." Preston tried to speak, his voice cracking. "Richard, we didn't know." "Didn't know?" Richard interrupted, his tone so cold it froze Preston mid-sentence. "Didn't know you were mocking the woman I love? Didn't know she was the only one who stood by me when every one of you turned your back? Didn't know you were revealing your true faces before the cameras?" The room sank into utter silence. The crystal light shimmered on the marble floor, reflecting in Emma's eyes. Tears glistened there, but did not fall. Beside her, Richard squeezed her hand, a silent gesture not just of love, but of justice reclaimed. He turned to Grayson, his voice calm but commanding. "Read the rest of the will." Grayson nodded, retrieving another sealed envelope, this one stamped with green wax. "This is the addendum," he said. It was added by Mr. Harrington before his disappearance, with a note that reads, "To be opened only when the truth is revealed." The entire room lifted their heads. Richard stepped back, his eyes fixed on the pale, frightened faces before him. "Because now," he said quietly, "I want to see who among you has the courage to listen to the end." The room was dead silent. The sharp sound of an envelope being unsealed echoed through the air, dry and final, like the first gunshot in a courtroom that allowed no mercy. Arthur Grayson placed a sheet of ivory paper on the oak table. His voice was steady, heavy, and cold as a gavel striking wood. "This addendum," he said, "is the final clause in the will of Mr. Richard Harrington. It states clearly, it shall only take effect if the legal heir, Mrs. Emma Clark Harrington, is publicly insulted during the reading of the will." A shiver rippled through the crowd. Every eye turned toward Emma, the woman they had mocked only minutes ago, now standing beside the man they believed to be dead. Richard folded his arms, his gaze sharp as steel. Arthur read it. Grayson nodded and continued. "If, on the day of the will reading, any individual displays contempt, mockery, or verbal insult toward my wife, the sole rightful heir, that person shall be removed from all entitlements, including any assets previously allocated. This decision is final and cannot be appealed." The words fell like blades slicing through the silence. Preston Hale shot to his feet, his face pale. "Wait! That's not fair. I didn't know who she— You didn't need to know, Richard interrupted, his voice deep as thunder. You don't need to know someone's title to treat them with decency. Madison trembled, clutching her brother's arm. Richard, we were just joking. He looked at her, and though there was no anger in his eyes, the disappointment was unbearable. Joking? You mocked the woman I love before you even knew who she was. Do you think your pride is a game? She lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. Her lipstick smeared. Chloe Brooks took a hesitant step forward, her voice high and shaking. I didn't mean to. I was just filming some stories. I didn't know Richard's gaze turned to her, icy and cutting. You turned my wife into a joke for thousands to see, just to chase attention. Now you know. He turned to Grayson. Write her name first. Grayson began writing slowly on the list. Each name that appeared sounded like a verdict. Preston Hale, stripped of all shares. Madison Hale, investment assets revoked. Chloe Brooks, termination of all media contracts and financial support. The scratching of the pen against paper echoed like the clink of chains tightening. Gerald Hayes tried to salvage his fate. Richard, I've served your company for over 20 years. You can't. Richard turned to him, his tone calm but cold. You served my money, not me. And when my wife stood before you, you said she disgraced the Harrington name. You chose your path. Beside him, Emma watched, her heart heavy. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction, only a quiet ache. They were falling apart, not because of her, but because of their own cruelty. She spoke softly. Richard, maybe they've learned their lesson. But he shook his head, his expression resolute. No, Emma. They only stop talking when they're caught. That's not the same as remorse. He gave a signal. Grayson pressed a button on the laptop. The large screen lit up again. Security footage played, every moment of humiliation Emma had endured since walking into the room. The laughter, the jeers, the sneers, all of it laid bare, undeniable, inescapable. Madison broke into sobs. Preston bent over, clutching his head. Chloe trembled as she watched herself on the screen, laughing, recording, turning the woman before her into a meme for the world. Every sound of laughter now cut back at them like a knife. Richard stood still, waiting until the video ended. Then he spoke slowly, each word sharp and deliberate. This is who you truly are. Not when you have wealth, but when you face someone you think is beneath you. He turned to Emma, his voice softening so only she could hear. Thank you for giving them the chance to reveal themselves. Now I'll give them the chance to leave. He looked toward the door and gave a slight nod. 2 men in suits entered. Escort them out. Preston resisted, shouting, Richard, I'm your blood. Richard met his gaze, unflinching. Blood doesn't make you loyal. Respect does. When the doors closed behind them, the room was nearly empty. No more clinking glasses, no more hollow laughter. Only silence, and the heavy sense that truth had just swept away every lie. Emma took a deep breath, her eyes shimmering. I never wanted revenge. I only wanted them to see themselves. Richard gave a faint, sorrowful smile, his hand tightening gently around hers. And they did, through the cruelest mirror possible. In that quiet, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a golden glow over them both, as if to say that in the end, justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand still and shine. The doors closed behind Preston, Madison, and their accomplices, the last echoes of high heels and feeble excuses fading into the marble hallway. But justice was not over. It had only just begun. Chloe Brooks still stood there, both hands gripping her phone tightly. The screen glowed, filled with comments from the story she had posted that morning, where she had called Emma a charity case, where tens of thousands had laughed along with her. Now, every line of text felt like a blade in her eyes. Richard turned to look at her, his expression no longer angry, only weighed down by disappointment. "You make a living off other people's lives, don't you?" he asked. Chloe swallowed hard. I just wanted attention. I didn't mean any harm." He raised an eyebrow, his voice dropping lower. "No harm. Yet you laughed while someone was being humiliated. No harm. Yet you profited from their pain. Tell me, Chloe, what exactly is harm then?" Her voice caught in her throat, her breathing shallow and uneven. Richard didn't need to shout. Every word he spoke fell like a stone. "Arthur," he said without turning, "open the media discipline file. It's time." Grayson gave a small nod, set the laptop on the table, and typed a few keys. The large screen behind him flickered to life, displaying the controlled dashboard of the Harrington Group's media division, where Chloe had once been the face of one of its luxury fashion brands. As Mr. Harrington instructed, Grayson said, "Ms. Brooks's contract is hereby terminated, effective immediately." A dry click followed. Chloe's phone buzzed violently in her hands. She looked down, eyes wide with disbelief. Notifications flooded in. Account suspended due to policy violation. Sponsorship contract revoked. Brand partnership terminated. Dozens of messages poured in from companies, some apologizing for adhering to ethical guidelines, others leaving only 3 cold words. "We're done." No, this can't be," Chloe whispered, her fingers trembling as she swiped across the screen. She tried to post a story, but the app wouldn't open. A red message appeared. This account no longer exists. Her social media empire, millions of followers, years of image building, all gone in seconds. She lifted her head, face pale, eyes blurred with tears. You destroyed me," she cried, her voice breaking. Richard replied quietly, "No. You destroyed yourself. I only let the world see it." The words ended everything. Chloe collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Across the room, Gerald Hayes and his wife still stood frozen. The emerald necklace around her neck glimmered under the chandelier, its brilliance now hollow, as false as their pride. "You called my wife uneducated and unworthy of this family," Richard said, his tone low but cutting enough to make them tremble. "Now tell me, which one of you is truly unworthy?" Gerald opened his mouth, but no sound came out. You stood among others and declared, "This is the family's disgrace." "I agree," Richard continued, his eyes cold as ice. "But that disgrace was never Emma. It was you." He nodded to Grayson. "They don't need to stay either." The security guards stepped forward, calm but firm. There were no shouts, no resistance, only slow footsteps and downcast eyes. As they passed Emma, Mrs. Hayes hesitated, her lips quivering as if she wanted to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Emma looked at her gently and said, "Some apologies only matter when they're said sooner." The woman burst into tears and walked on. When the doors closed again, only Richard, Emma, Grayson, and 3 others remained at the far end of the room. Sarah Ellis, Michael Reed, and Anna Coleman, the elderly gardener with the rough, calloused hands. Richard looked at them, his voice deep but warm again. Out of dozens of people here, only 3 said nothing. No laughter, no contempt, no greed. You 3 kept your decency. He walked to Anna and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for offering Emma that glass of water this morning. You may not realize it, but that small gesture said everything." Anna bowed her head, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. Grayson smiled kindly. "It seems your test has yielded its results." Emma turned to Richard, her gaze softening. "I didn't want to see them suffer. I only wanted them to understand." "I know," he replied gently, his hand closing over hers. But sometimes the truth doesn't hurt because it's cruel. It hurts because it's real. Outside, the sky had turned golden. The sunset light streamed through the tall windows, shining over their clasped hands, one that had trembled under humiliation, and one that had once lost faith in humanity. Now, both had found what mattered most: dignity and integrity. The will reading had ended, but its echo would linger forever, like a bell tolling in reminder that in a world full of deceit, respect remains the truest measure of a human being. The room slowly sank into silence. The last echoes of footsteps from those who had been cast out faded down the marble corridor, disappearing like the dying breath of an era gone by. There was no more mocking laughter, no more clinking of wine glasses. Only the golden light of sunset streamed through the tall windows, falling across the white marble floor, painting it with warm amber streaks. Emma Clark Harrington stood in the center of that room, no longer the woman in the gray dress they had once ridiculed, but the woman who had made an empire bow its head. Yet her face held no triumph, only calmness and a quiet sorrow, as though she mourned the souls who had lost themselves to pride. Beside her, Richard Harrington watched his wife silently. He knew that look, the look of someone who forgives even when no one deserves it. He stepped forward and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "You did better than anyone could have," he said softly. Emma turned, her smile faint as mist. "No, Richard. I only let them see themselves." At the far end of the room, Sarah Ellis, Michael Reed, and Anna Coleman stood motionless. They felt as though they had stepped into another world, one where justice was not a punishment, but a lesson. Richard turned to them, his eyes softening, his voice filled with gratitude. "The three of you are the reason I still believe kindness hasn't vanished from this world." Sarah, the elderly nurse with silver hair, wiped her eyes. "I only did what anyone should do. I saw her walk in, and everyone turned away. I couldn't stand it." Emma smiled gently and took her hand. "And that's what makes the difference." "Thank you, Sarah." Michael Reed, the librarian with the worn glasses, lowered his head. "I recognized her the moment she walked in. 7 years ago, when I signed as a witness for that wedding, she said something I've never forgotten. If one day the world forgets the value of kindness, I'll remind it. And today you did exactly that." Emma's eyes shimmered. "It wasn't just me," she said softly. "You all helped keep that memory alive." Anna Coleman, the gardener with calloused hands, wiped her tears with her sleeve. "I only saw her standing alone, so I brought her some water. I didn't know who she was." Richard smiled kindly. "And that's what makes your act the most precious of all. You helped someone without needing to know what they could give you in return." The room grew quiet again. A gentle silence filled the space, no longer heavy with tension, but with gratitude. Richard turned to Grayson and gave a small nod. "Arthur, handle the rest." Grayson opened the final folder, his voice steady and warm. "According to Mr. Harrington's wishes, the three individuals present here, Sarah Ellis, Michael Reed, and Anna Coleman, will receive lifelong housing, education, and support grants from the Harrington Foundation as recognition for their honesty and compassion." The three stood in stunned silence. Sarah shook her head, overcome. "I don't need money, Mr. Harrington." "It's not money," Richard replied. "It's a thank you. Because you reminded us that kindness still has value." Emma squeezed his hand and whispered, "Perhaps this is your true legacy." Richard looked at her, a quiet smile touching his lips. Not the empire, not the wealth, but how people choose to treat one another. He glanced around the now empty room, the abandoned chairs, half-finished glasses of wine, the faint traces of tears and footprints on the floor, all remnants of a storm that had passed. But in the golden light, there was no ruin, only renewal. Emma walked to the center of the room and gazed out the window where the sun was setting. "I used to think that those who looked down on me were bad people," she said softly. But they weren't. They had only forgotten that self-respect can't be bought. She turned back, her eyes gentle as water. "And today," we reminded them. Richard stepped beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Then let's go," he said. "We have a new world to begin again." Together, they walked out of the room, leaving behind the golden light that glowed on the wooden walls and the steady ticking of the clock. No more false laughter, only the quiet echo of truth. Respect never needs to be proven by status. It only requires a heart that can truly see another human being. The evening breeze drifted through the marble hallway, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender from the garden behind the estate. The sky tilted into shades of amber, and the last rays of sunlight stretched across the marble floor, where Richard and Emma Harrington walked side by side, slowly, quietly, and with meaning. The great wooden doors closed behind them, the sound echoing like the final punctuation to a long chapter of pride and deceit. Inside, empty chairs remained, glasses of wine stood unfinished, and in the air lingered the faint blend of expensive perfume and regret. Emma stopped at the steps and glanced back at the room behind her. The place that had once been a battlefield of ambition, now nothing more than the remnants of a tragic play. "It's strange," she said softly, "how people can spend their whole lives building a perfect image, only to lose everything in a single moment of disrespect." Richard stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the sunlit hills in the distance. "I used to think a person's greatest strength was intellect," he said. "But it's not. It's compassion, because only compassion can give intelligence its worth." She smiled, gentle and bittersweet, and only compassion can give wealth its meaning. A light breeze brushed past, lifting the hem of her gray dress. The same old cardigan rested on her shoulders, just as it had that morning when she first stepped into the manor. Simple, calm, and without the need to prove anything. She hadn't changed. It was the world around her that had, now that it finally saw her for who she truly was. In the distance, Sarah, Michael, and Anna stood waiting by the gate, their faces glowing with quiet joy and emotion. Sarah spoke softly. "I've seen many families torn apart by money, but I've never seen anyone heal them with kindness." Emma smiled warmly. "We never wanted revenge. We only wanted them to see themselves, so they might still have the chance to become better people." Michael Reed, the elderly librarian, adjusted his glasses and said slowly, "Sometimes people must lose everything before they remember what was truly valuable." Richard nodded. "And sometimes it only takes one small act to change how the world sees a person." The three of them bowed slightly, then turned to leave. Before she walked away, Anna said quietly, "If you ever need it, sir, the garden will always be ready to welcome you. The lavender blooms best in May." Richard smiled faintly. "Thank you, Anna. That garden, like you, reminds people there's still hope." As they left, the courtyard of Harrington Manor fell silent again. The sound of dry leaves rustling beneath Emma's feet was like the past being crushed into dust. She looked up at the golden sky, where birds were flying home. "Do you remember our wedding day?" she asked. "I remember every detail," Richard said with a smile. "Your dress, the white bouquet, and the words you said at the altar. I don't need anything except a life that feels real." Emma nodded softly. "I've kept that promise. But today, I wanted the world to understand that a real life sometimes has to pass through the storm of lies." Richard looked at her, pride and sorrow mingling in his eyes. He took her hand, his warmth weaving through the cold gaps of the past. "You didn't need to defeat them," he said quietly, "because you already defeated your own silence. The way you stood still in the storm, that's power." A single tear slid down Emma's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, as if letting it carry away every insult, every contemptuous glance, and every misunderstood day. "I don't hate them," she whispered. "I only feel sorry. Sorry that they haven't learned respect isn't a privilege, it's a choice." They walked down the steps together, hand in hand. The sky opened wide before them, the last sunlight brushing their hair like a blessing. Behind them, the doors of Harrington Manor slowly closed. But in the glow of dusk, it no longer looked like a fortress of wealth. It had become a symbol, a lesson in dignity. Richard stopped at the gate and looked back one final time. "We spent years building an empire," he said, "but it only took one day to realize that the only thing worth keeping is the truth." Emma squeezed his hand and whispered, "And kindness." They smiled at each other. No more words were needed. Only the final sunlight fell upon their silhouettes as they walked away, glimmering along the path that led beyond the iron gates, where all falsehoods were left behind, and truth began to bloom. Late afternoon. The last rays of sunlight bathed the lavender garden behind the Harrington estate in gold. The flowers swayed gently in the wind, their fragrance soft as memory. Emma stood in the courtyard, still wearing her gray dress and old cardigan. Everything around her was unusually quiet, with only the wind and the faint rustle of leaves breaking the silence. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in every breath. Richard Harrington stepped outside, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed her one, his voice deep yet gentle. "I used to think people had to lose everything to learn the real lessons of life. But today, I've realized that sometimes all one needs to lose is pride." Emma smiled softly. "I never wanted them to suffer. I only wanted them to understand." Richard nodded, his gaze tender. "And you made them understand, not through power, but through silence." They sat together on the stone bench in the middle of the garden. Before them, the sky turned violet, its calm light shimmering across the distant lake. "You know," Richard said, "when I faked my death, I wasn't afraid of being forgotten. I was afraid the world would forget compassion. But you've made me believe it still exists." Emma looked at him quietly. "You once told me justice isn't revenge. Now I understand. It's when the truth is finally seen." A soft breeze passed through, making the lavender tremble as if bowing. She whispered, "We don't need fame. We don't need wealth. We only need to know that we have lived right." Richard took her hand. "That's true. Because sometimes a single act of kindness, a single word said at the right moment, is enough to change the world." The 2 of them sat there, silent, watching the sun disappear beyond the hills. The final light fell upon their joined hands, reflecting a small gleam, the glow of kindness and dignity. In that twilight, Emma Harrington was no longer the woman mocked during the will reading. She was a reminder to the world that respect does not need power to be proven, only a heart to be practiced. And as the sun vanished completely behind the hills, the truth remained, quiet, steadfast, and more radiant than ever. Night fell over the Harrington estate, but the garden still glowed, not from lights, but from the lavender in full bloom, a quiet reminder that true beauty never needs to boast. The story of Emma and Richard was never just about wealth, inheritance, or power. It was a reminder that respect is not a privilege reserved for a few, but a duty shared by all. Because with just one unkind word, you can wound an entire heart. Yet with a single act of kindness, you can save someone's entire day. If this story has made you believe that kindness is never weakness, leave a like to help spread that message. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that a person's true worth is not defined by their status, but by how they treat others. And if you wish to continue this journey through stories of dignity, justice, and compassion, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because sometimes it only takes one small story to make the whole world stop and think.